Tomar, member of Center of Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovation at JGBS, and I'm also faculty in the area of marketing and communication. I welcome you all to the 11th and final lecture of the Pandemic Lecture Series hosted by Center of Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovation. In short, we also call it CAPBREI. During the Pandemic Lecture Series, we got the opportunity to hear insights from industry experts, professors from globally renowned universities, and JGBS professors who shared highly valuable content around COVID-19, disaster governance, and decision-making in uncertain times, just to mention a few. Today happens to be the last and final lecture from the pandemic series. I am glad to announce that today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Professor Richa Shukla. She is a philosopher and her current engagement is with JGBS. During the series is on, I would request all the participants to please type in any questions in the chat box provided. We will be taking the question answers during the Q&A round at the end. Also, please ensure that your mics are on mute mode throughout the lecture. Once again, I welcome Professor Richa to please take over the virtual dais. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meenakshi Tomar. Hello, everybody. I am Richa, and before I begin, firstly, I would really like to convey my deep sense of gratitude to Center for Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovation. I would really like to thank Professor Anirban Ganguly, who is the director of the center, Professor Meenakshi Tomar, Professor Satnam, Professor Chitrakalpa Sen, Professor Chitresh Kumar, Professor Anuj Kapoor, and my sincere apologies if in case I'm missing on to any volunteer's name or any other faculty name. Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, I am the person who would be who would also be presenting the closing remarks in that way, because my lecture would be the last lecture in this series, I think which started in March somewhere when this entire COVID thing started. So today I would be sharing my views on mundaneness of crisis and vulnerability. And before I before I start talking about why or what is the mundaneness of crisis and vulnerability, I just wanted to take you guys through a very interesting tale, which basically made me stumbled upon why did I choose to talk on mundaneness of crisis and vulnerability. So I think I remember this happened 5-6 years back when I was doing my PhD, and my supervisor, late Professor Satyapal Gautam, we were having some chat, and considering how willfully ignorant I was at that point of time, I ended up saying him that if people don't understand what I'm talking about, it's their problem, At the end of the day, I'm a philosopher. And he could sense some kind of intellectual arrogance in which I was talking. And in a very simple manner, and considering the kind of Wittgensteinian fan he was, he said, okay, so are you telling me that you're going to be a bad philosopher entire your life? I couldn't really follow him. So I asked him, what do you mean? And he said that keep this fact very clear in your mind, Richa. In philosophy, there's nothing like right and wrong. There are good philosophers and there are bad philosophers. And if you want to be a good philosopher, you should be able to talk in the most commonsensical language. And the most complicated and complex concept which you have read somewhere, and that book could be of 300 pages, 500 pages, 10 pages, you should be in a position to explain it to a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 60-year-old, irrespective of the fact of what background they're coming from. Because philosophy can be done in the most commonsensical and ordinary language. Because at the end of the day, what philosophers are talking about, it impacts they are talking about society. They are talking about how society should be. They are trying to recreate or recapture the imagination of the people who are living in society. So when he said that, I, considering, I don't know what I was thinking in that moment, I completely negated him by saying, no, 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 it doesn't matter. And later on, I realized when I was writing my thesis and I was working on my PhD, I started grappling and I was stumbling upon the similar kind of question that do philosophers or maybe academicians in general, do they intentionally talk in a manner so that the ordinary people do not get to know about it? Because at the end of the day, we are talking about society, we are talking about human beings, we are talking about the self and other relationship. But why is it that many people, many of my friends who are in academics, but still they are very critical of the way academics work, they have always been telling me that this kind of armchair philosophy which you do, there is a wide gap, Richa, between what's happening in society and what you guys are talking. So I thought when Professor Chitrakalp Sen shared this idea with me that, would you like to talk about, or would you like to share your views? Would you like to give a lecture? I thought, in that moment that this could be that opportunity for me. I know it's a big, long wall and it cannot be dismantled in a day, but I thought that maybe I can take a moment where I can explain to a crowd, to an audience, that yes, philosophy can be done in an ordinary language without using rhetoric or without using some intellectual jargons. So I thought that when I am talking about philosophizing COVID-19 and the kinds of concepts which I have been using, or which I have used, which I'll be using in today's lecture, those are just very theoretically tight concepts. So I thought, let's just try to treat or handle the bull in that first-hand manner. And I thought that let's talk about the everydayness. So those who aren't coming from philosophy background, mundaneness stands for everydayness or ordinary. So I thought let's talk about the ordinariness or the everydayness of crisis and vulnerability, which COVID has brought into our lives. So this was the reason why I thought that crisis and vulnerability in COVID-19 times could be it is one of the strong, it's like a conjunction between these two. And I thought that trying to understand these 3.5 months which have passed, and of course the coming months, the way they are going to unwrap themselves, the concept of crisis and vulnerability, it stays as a constant throughout. So I thought that I would be talking, this could be a good platform to talk about crisis and vulnerability, because let's accept it, COVID-19 is a crisis, the way it happened, the way it started unfolding itself. At the same time, we all have been vulnerable in our lives. We are vulnerable human beings. The moment we trust someone, the moment we make friends, the moment we step outside or we stay inside, the concept of vulnerability has deep dimension meaning. And I thought that when I started observing COVID-19 times as a philosopher, I thought that, in Indian sphere, it definitely is giving a different meaning. It's a little twisted meaning which the term vulnerability is getting assigned to itself in Indian sphere. And I thought, let's talk about it. So here I am. So basically what I am going to do today is, there are 2-3 larger arguments in my lecture throughout. Firstly, I would be taking you guys through to understand and to think out collectively that in the contemporary times, like in 2019, 2020 times, when we see what are the philosophical developments when we talk about the concept of vulnerability. It's no more the abstract philosophical love that Immanuel Kant or David Hume used to talk about. There's a lot of good work in philosophy which is coming out, or which is deriving every day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those concepts and I am going to extend it to a particular stage where I explain it to you, the relevance or the shortcomings of those concepts from in an Indian sphere. So we would be, collectively thinking through few events which has happened throughout pandemic, and one of the larger arguments which I am interested in taking you through is also the fact that, yes, philosophically, vulnerability remains that emotion, it remains that condition which makes us stranger to our own self, because the way we react, the way we handle it, the way we think we will navigate through it, but we don't end up navigating the same way. So I thought that maybe breaking down this concept of vulnerability and trying to understand it amidst COVID-19 time could be something interesting to collectively think through. Having said that, I would begin my lecture for today. So even though I have my philosophical um, uh, reservations on few of Martha Nussbaum's position, who is a feminist philosopher. But still, I was reading something, what she has written, and I came across this line and I thought this actually also in a way echoes about what I'm going to talk about in my today's lecture. So she says this in an interview which was published, I believe, in New York Times, that what I am calling for is a society of citizens who admit that they are needy and vulnerable. So someone like Nussbaum is explaining to us that inherently the very idea that we live in a society and the very idea that we are going for mutual coexistence, mutual dependence, that in itself screams and tells us that we are vulnerable human beings. And when she's talking about the concept of vulnerability, she's saying that we don't need to sideline it, or we don't need to bracket it by saying or by thinking that it's something which makes us miserable in nature. At the end of the day, confessing and believing that yes, we are living in a society in which we are dependent on each other. Now, for instance, if I have to explain this to you by keeping in mind COVID-19 crisis which is going on, I think all of us are aware that this is actually, in that way, these are the perfect time which are mocking our so-called Western concept of individuality. Even though there are many of us who still believe that a person can be an island to himself or herself, but these are the times where when I see the extension of this concept of vulnerability, not only you have frontline workers, and when I use the term frontline workers, I'm just not bringing in the contribution and the labor which doctors, nurses are performing, but it in that way brings in the entire unrecognized labor, which is being done, like to what extent are we actually in these times, the way we were dependent on the local shops, which has been existing since ages in India, the way we have been relying and depending on the sweeper who sweeps our house and who makes a point of cleaning it, the way so many essential workers who are basically the frontline workers, and even when one day these days, their absence, it mocks our idea of being self-sufficient or self-efficient. So when we are talking about vulnerability or crisis, it takes me to a larger philosophical question, which someone called Aristotle asked us so many years back, so many decades back, that how should a human live? How should a human lead a life? Which kind of life can be considered as an authentic life? It is in this line that I thought that I should reinvoke, or I should address the concept and the conjunction between crisis and vulnerability, how ordinary it is, and how ordinary yet extraordinary it has become during COVID-19 crisis. So one of the larger arguments which I would be dealing in today's lecture are these. Firstly, I am interested in talking about the philosophical implications of COVID-19, the philosophical aspect of vulnerability during COVID-19. What is the Indian side? And when I use the term Indian, I'm aware that it's not a homogeneous term, and there is a lot of intersectionality along gender, caste, religion, tribe, subsect, etc. Now, one of the larger arguments which I am trying to offer to the people who are listening to me is this, that can we see vulnerability as a unifying common ground amidst this crisis, irrespective of what class, what gender, what sexual identity, what religion, what class we are talking about? Can we not see vulnerability as that unifying common ground which has the capability of bringing people or strangers in solidarity with each other? When I am talking about something like this, I am trying to make an argument by saying that vulnerability can bring people together. It has the potential, it has the epistemological, ontological potential of creating a ground of solidarity. I remember recently, me and a friend of mine, Delorina, we ended up writing this article on how COVID-19 is creating this sense of stranger, or this idea of stranger is getting created in India. So one of the few arguments which I also wanted to think through, that even though when largely we are talking about Indian sphere, COVID could be seen as that unifying ground, which is not only potentially but also in actuality, it's bringing strangers in solidarity with each other. One of the larger ideas which I have been very interested in talking through, which I would be touching throughout when I am talking about COVID-19 times, is the concept of abject bodies. So abject bodies, in that way, it refer to the bodies which can be considered as disrespectful, the bodies which do not matter, like a body of a particular person because of the affiliation that person is coming from is given a particular kind of respect. And the body, how COVID-19, how during COVID-19 crisis, there is a creation of abject bodies, which is happening, which is adding a different meaning, which is giving a different meaning to the entire concept of this entire fiasco, this entire picture of COVID-19. Now, one of the few things which I observed while I've been thinking through these issues was that how the idea of ordinary has changed. Now, something which we used to take it for granted, just the fact of going outside and picking something which we want to, has changed. So in these three and a half months, this is something which I would also like to contest, that the idea of mundane, which is ordinary, the idea of ordinary and the idea of crisis, the concept of crisis, COVID-19 has changed it in a way. Now, I remember initially when I came to Delhi, which was 10 years back, I believe, and those people who used to put masks, many people used to mock them by saying, what's wrong with them? Why are they doing it? It doesn't really matter. That was some kind of ordinary for a few set of people. But now, when we are exposing ourselves to in a public space, and we see everybody around us, bodies in flesh and blood covered throughout. So it made me think that how COVID-19 in that way is evoking, and it's making us think that, quote unquote, this idea of mundane or ordinary, or this idea of crisis, how it's changing its meaning on multiple layers. So these are one of the larger arguments which I am interested in talking through today while I'm trying to establish my larger argument that vulnerability in that way has the potential of creating or giving a sense of solidarity in this strange world full of strangers. So one of the few things which I would like to address today is, which I also said in the introduction, that when people say that nothing has changed or things are pretty much how they are going to be, I think philosophically there's this feminist philosopher, and I really like her work. Those of you who are interested in reading, they can definitely refer to her. Many people, I think many of you might also know her as a feminist. Her name is Simone de Beauvoir. And she has written this text called The Ethics of Ambiguity, where throughout her text, she has only been talking about how we are mutually codependent on each other. Now, when she, at that point of time, when she wrote that text, I doubt if even she would have thought that to what extent the present time is basically mocking our idea of being self-sufficient. And I don't think the idea of self-sufficient is only getting revoked because we are surrounded around so many people and we are dependent on them regarding few services. Not that it hasn't happened before as well, but as I said earlier, that because these COVID times where everything which we considered as normal, I don't know what people understand or what people think through when they even use this term called normal. There are many philosophers who have also contested this term called normal and natural. But still, just for the sake of it, when we say that, this idea of this idea of being the way I am and not at all getting bothered, not at all getting affected by what's happening around us, these could be the times which are mocking us in that way. That, as human beings, as a society, it's impossible to even create a society where we are saying that I'm an individual, I am not worried about what's happening around us because I am completely independent of what's happening around me. At the end of the day, I feel these are the times which are questioning our concept, our understanding of self-sufficient. And it's precisely also happening because these times are screaming and they are telling us that you cannot have absolute freedom. You have relative freedom with situated choices. And, these aren't something very great thing which out of nowhere has come. Philosophers have been talking about it since ages now. But I think maybe this could be the tip of the iceberg, where we can see the practical aspect, we can see the practical application of things like this happening. Now, I feel since inception, vulnerability has been an essential part of human existence. One can analyze its relationship with power, self, body, war sites, rapes, oppression, domination, femininity, masculinity, and borders. But in today's lecture, we would largely be trying to understand our relationship with vulnerability, that during COVID-19 times, what are the layers of these vulnerability? Now, if I have to break it in a very commonsensical language, and if I have to explain it in a very simple language, think about it that any object, or think about an onion, it has many layers, and we peel off all the layers to understand how it is. The same goes for vulnerability. There are layers. If this is our identity, there are layers of vulnerability. And how is it related to crisis? And has it ever multiplied, or is it multiplied during COVID-19 times? So what I'm going to do right now is I am going to take some types of vulnerabilities which has recently been worked in the philosophical domain, and I would be breaking it through from an Indian sphere perspective during COVID-19 times. And of course, these aren't final observations. They are open for criticism and opposition. But I thought, in my limited understanding, I thought that it should be good that when we are talking about the current times, it would be interesting to demystify this relationship between how is COVID impacting a human being these days. So there are different types of vulnerability. First is mutual vulnerability. Two people living together, staying together, families staying together because of their needs, because of their everyday wants, how they are dependent on each other. And hence that vulnerability is mutual in nature. There's this philosopher called Robert Boudin. He has given this consequentialist theory of vulnerability, that it's the center of the moral obligation to protect the vulnerable. So if Boudin would have been here, he would have said that nothing doing, we are living in a time which is full of challenges. So the group which is least which is the most marginalized in a society, the group which is at the bottom, those who are well-to-do in a society, they have a moral obligation to protect the vulnerable. And by doing that, you are not doing any favor to them. Because he was a moral philosopher, he said that it's a moral imperative. It's your moral duty to protect the vulnerable. So I think these days this fashion has it's pretty new, that when something happens and when people they get met through some accident, or when some kind of things, not very pleasant things are happening in the public sphere, people either start recording or they start going they go live on Facebook or Instagram or whatever these mediums are. Someone like Boudin would critique it, and he would say that when you're doing something like this, you are contradicting your moral obligation of which is there to protect the vulnerable. Now there is this concept of vulnerability called extended vulnerability, which Marilyn Friedman has worked on, and I thought it's pretty interesting in the current time. And in fact, if we break it down in an Indian sphere, it can give us some interesting outputs. So she has written this article called Moral Responsibility for Coerced Wrongdoing, the case of abused women who fail to protect their children. So in this essay, she talks about the extended vulnerability which a woman, her children, the father, they all go through when it's a troubled marriage, when it's an abusive relationship. She argues that in these kinds of relationship, the moral agency of the people who are involved, the moral agency of the father, the moral agency of the mother, it gets hampered. And interestingly, I think it happened in April, perhaps, when initially it was just feminists of the first world, but even in India, many scholars started working on the fact that how just the way lockdown was going on and how rampant it was, how it's impacting the mental health of the woman, of the homemaker, how burdened they are becoming with this multiplied labor which is getting increased, because children aren't going to school, husband isn't going to office, the work is getting multiplied on various fronts. At the same time, many feminists started coming out with findings that how sexual, emotional, psychological abuse, it has increased. Now, when we talk about this concept of extended vulnerability, think about a family in that way during COVID-19. A broken family, if either the husband or the wife, if they are in an abusive marriage, and how and to what extent their vulnerability increases on a multiplied level, and how it gets extended to the children as well. that the idea of going out, because why public space becomes so important. Public space means why going out becomes so important, because you just don't go out to loiter. At times you also go out because you wanted to clear your head. You think that going out perhaps would just give you a breather. But these feminists who have been writing about how domestic abuse have increased during COVID-19, this from an Indian perspective could come under the larger umbrella of extended vulnerability, how vulnerabilities are extended in a family during COVID-19. So while reading her essay from an Indian perspective, I realized that silences which exist in Indian household and how it could be addressed in this realm. For instance, the way housewife in India performs her daily chores, and if she is part of an abusive relationship, or if the husband is part of the abusive relationship, and to what extent her precariousness increases. It makes him or her believe that unbounded labor, which doesn't fetch any capital from it, is of no good use. The precarity or the vulnerability which exists in the mundaneness, lived reality of that woman, when she is make to believe that beginning from the house to which she is, where she is doing so much of work, to who she is nothing belongs to her. She was never the master. Also, interestingly, because these days, I think when all these issues were happening, there were instances of certain kind of discrimination as well, which was happening. And as a philosopher, it was interesting also for me to think through that why something like this happened. Like when we discriminate, like I think yesterday also it happened, perhaps those of you who are on Twitter or Facebook, you might have come across this event where I think it happened in Surat, where the banker, I think he was a cop or a guy who was a police personnel. He enters the bank, and there was some, confrontation, and I don't know what happened. And he ended up entering the area where that woman was sitting, and he slapped her out of nowhere. Everything was on the CCTV footage, but later on he got suspended, and there was an FIR perhaps filed against him or something like that. So when we see instances like these happening, where these kinds of instances basically raise the concept of abject bodies, what we call in philosophy, that why that woman in flesh and blood, why her body, why her existence in flesh and blood could be seen as something which could be dismissed, which could be disrespected so easily. Think about it this way: if there would have been a man, trying to get into confrontation with him, would he have reacted the way he reacted? So I thought that, during these times, this concept of abject bodies is something that very interestingly it was reintroducing itself in our lives. So I thought that of all these kinds of types of vulnerabilities that I would be discussing today, it becomes important that we address the concept of body and why bodies matter during COVID-19 times, whether it's about looking on a body for closure, whether it's giving a gaze to a body by saying, doesn't really matter who you are, or giving a gaze which is a gaze of appreciation and saying, no, your existence matters. So there's this feminist called Miana Lotz, and in her essay, Parental Values and Children's Vulnerability, she has argued on the influence which parents have on their child, which leads to child's vulnerability to parental values. So she has used these terms called authority privilege, proximity privilege, priority privilege. So according to her, parents have priority privilege in the light of them taking care of their children. Most of the time, they become their first source of values, which the children acquire. Parents also have authority privilege and proximity privilege. And these effects of privilege which they have used or which they can use in the life of their children, which makes them vulnerable. Now, when children become prone to have disrespectful attitude, for instance, towards homosexual, when we see xenophobia, or when we see hatred towards few minority religions or a particular class or a particular caste, why does that happen? And philosophically, I would like to argue that I think during these times, there were many videos which were getting circulated on social networking sites where we could see that people were asking vegetable vendors, tell me, who are you? What is your full name? And in most cases, the vegetable vendors were forced to lie, or things like this happening. And I came across many videos in which young boys, fortunately or unfortunately in Indian society, still girls don't have that much of privilege to access mobility in that way. So of course, most of the videos I've seen young boys trying to bully vegetable vendors and asking them, what is your full name? Who are you? And events like this, it made me think that in that way, family also becomes the first institution where an 8-year-old kid, a 10-year-old kid, a 5-year-old kid forms his value system. And when we see this otherness happening in society, that, for instance, if I'm the self, and when I'm questioning your body, when I'm questioning your identity, when I'm questioning your existence, I'm making you the other. I am making you the stranger in this country, or wherever. When we talk about Black Lives Matter, for that matter, when we see, I remember during one of the lectures in my class, when we were talking about solidarity, I was discussing this concept of discrimination with my students. And in a way, most of them, they were agreeing, in a way subtly, that yes, there is a hierarchy between genders, there is a hierarchy between sexual identities. There is a gaze which we give when we look at someone who is a transgender. There is a gaze which we give to someone who is not coming from my community, who is dressed inappropriately. And instances like these also made me think that have becoming transphobic, xenophobic, homophobic, that is the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot in that iceberg. And what are these lots? One of it is that somewhere or the other, when that child was growing up, maybe he saw it happening in his family or in her family, and she thought, this is natural, this is how things are supposed to be. And especially during these times when so rigidly we are creating this idea of other, this someone who is other, who is distinct from us, who is different from us, for whom we don't have a sense of empathy or sympathy, and we are hell-bound to discriminate. These instances made me think that maybe when Mayana Lotz talked about this different kind of vulnerability in reference to the upper hand which parents have while raising their kids, or the upper hand which family as an institution have, which can come under proximity privilege, priority privilege, authority privilege. And I feel that when we see discrimination happening out, which has happened a lot during these times, we should, I think, also remember what was happening in the United States of America a few weeks back, where the entire system was upside down. So I feel it's just not happening out of nowhere. It's just not happening because people have this different idea about Black people, about white people, about different ideas about different religions and caste and gender identities and sexual identities. But it's also happening because that is the final, how do I explain to you? That is the final symptom which you have got of some kind of issue which is deep down in the psyche of the person. For instance, when COVID-19 thing happened, so many friends of mine who are from Northeast, somewhere or the other, those who were staying in Delhi, there was a gaze which was telling them that, or we all could see the videos where they were prone to direct discrimination. People were calling them a particular, word, which basically they were trying to imply something. I would not like to add sand to the beach because I don't believe in that language. But what I'm trying to invoke to the readers, to the audiences, is this, that this is the time actually where you are getting a lot of time to stay in your home, to think. So just by watching something and sharing something, the nature or the veracity of the crisis doesn't change unless and until you don't act on it and you don't think through about why it's happening, why someone would be prone to this kind of vulnerability in so much of crisis time. Until then, the issue won't be resolved. Now, there are different kinds of vulnerability that we were discussing: nihilistic vulnerability, situational vulnerability, inherent vulnerability. And situational vulnerability and inherent vulnerability, they have a very strong relationship with each other. For instance, if I talk about nihilistic vulnerability, it says that, so fragility plays a very important role in this vulnerability. This vulnerability stands for the fact that the person concerned who is vulnerable is not that significant. So this is where the concept of abject bodies comes in, with someone like Judith Butler says that why few bodies matter over another, why few lives matter over another. Why do we see that there are cases where this the violence which happens within a four wall to a particular gender, or the violence which happen when someone who is gender non-conformist, when they are trying to reclaim the public space. Many people, I think so many of us might have heard that how initially so many Northeasterns, those people who come from Northeast, they can explain to you a certain kind of vocabulary in which people talk to them. And when something like this happens, there is a larger message which goes out to everybody, that there are few lives which would matter to us rather than few lives which are out there. So when we are talking about nihilistic vulnerability, which is explaining to us that few bodies are less important than other bodies, in this larger umbrella of vulnerability, the cases of domestic sexual abuse which are rising during lockdown time, they can come in. And why do we think that, what is the reason that at the end of the day, during lockdown times, what makes a person, what makes a man or a woman or whatever gender they are coming from, what makes their body less acceptable or less accepted in a society, even in this current time where things are so challenging, where we still are so uncertain about the future. Now, when we are talking about nihilistic vulnerability, I thought it would be interesting to talk about and to raise the concept of migrants. We all have seen that during these times, we saw thousands of migrants who were forced to leave the city because there was no work, or maybe because the city couldn't accommodate them, whatever respective would be, walking millions of miles, thousands of miles. And because of COVID, the situation that was there, they were forced to ask or leave the city. Now, this would be situational vulnerability, that a family of laborers who are working, they were trying to create a city, they were trying to create a building in which many people would be living. Out of nowhere, lockdown was announced. And because of that situation in which there was no work, they were forced to exercise a choice where they had to go back to their hometown. Few were walking, few were waiting for trains, buses. Also, the way this situation was handled says a lot about abject bodies. There would be inherent vulnerability in situations like this, when we see that there were news where many migrants were dying, many laborers were dying because of hunger. So this is how during COVID-19, we can see an intersectionality between situational vulnerability and inherent vulnerability. Now, when we talk about abject bodies during COVID-19 and how abject bodies are giving rise to a different kind of vulnerability, I feel that these bodies, who are these abject bodies? These are the same set of bodies who do not have strong claims to make. They can't make epistemological, social, political make. They aren't the one who have any political choice to exercise. And perhaps that's the reason they are labeled as those bodies. Now, how every time, whenever a mass shooting happens in any of the first world country, every concern, and most of the time our concern is to understand the historicity of that white upper class masculine man, and the purpose is to understand how troubling his childhood was. That was the reason he ended up doing violence. We like to philosophize about how toxic his childhood was, which made him become who he has become. On the contrary, those dead bodies, or those abject bodies which has been killed, which could be the bodies of the migrants, which could be the bodies of refugees, which could be the bodies of people from minority religions, how it becomes nothing apart from flesh and blood. We don't even dare to or care to understand the nature of those bodies, because then in these kinds of movements, or when we see so many people, when there was no job and these migrants were leaving these big metropolitan cities, and we could see that in these movements there were so many pictures and there was so many news of many migrants who died because of food and so many things here and there, and how in the news, when the news come to us, how they have been labeled as those bodies. And these are the situation. COVID-19 would be a perfect situation in that way, which is screaming to us about the concept of abject bodies, that few bodies matter over another. As for us, those bodies are abject bodies. Those are immigrant bodies. Those are bodies of refugees. Hence, because they have no stake in any political discourse, their absence or presence doesn't really matter. Let's take, one more example, like this entire example of so many people walking back to their hometowns, the way it happened, and we saw a sea of bodies, sea of people walking back to their hometown. These bodies were walking, these people were walking thousands, millions of miles because the city couldn't give them shelter. Now, also perhaps maybe because the city refused to give them shelter, because there are few bodies which will matter over another. Now, this is a very philosophical, strong ground of vulnerability during COVID-19 times, that it is, in a very stark, in a very straight-handed manner, it's creating a line that there are few bodies which matter, which we are going to take care of, and there are few bodies which do not matter because they do not have stake to talk about, because they don't have the social political identity in a way. Now, how migrant bodies could be considered as abject bodies, how these bodies are stigmatized during COVID-19 times. Now, there's this philosopher called Judith Butler. She's a feminist philosopher, and she has, in fact, written a lot on this concept of abjection. And she says that this abjection is a process, it's a discursive process. But the way I try to understand COVID-19 situation in Indian sphere, I feel that it's abjection, or somebody becoming an abjection body. It's not a process. It's in that way, it happens in movement. Abjection becomes in a movement. Hence, living with that abjection body, living with that stigmatized body, living with that taboo body, it becomes a process. It becomes a journey. Now, also philosophically, interestingly, when we assign abject body to someone, we take away their right to have an agency. We take away their right to have a social, political, moral agency. Now, when we are talking about, when we are discussing about vulnerability and different kinds of vulnerability, situational vulnerability could be one of the important paradigmatic vulnerabilities in the current time. So situational vulnerability is context specific and is caused or exacerbated by social, political, economic, or environmental factors. It may be short-term, intermittent, or enduring. There is a possibility that situational vulnerability might give rise to inherent vulnerability. For instance, when we talk about COVID example, how there are so many instances that the way it happened, the way it was handled, there was a situation in which the COVID-19 happened, and what were the after effects of the people who had to make choices during this pandemic, and how it was related, or how strong the conjunction was between situational and inherent vulnerability. Now, different vulnerabilities will have different meanings depending on who has been experiencing it, in what conditions, as well as the body. But I thought that maybe it would be interesting here to bring in the concept of, like, when we are trying to understand inherent vulnerability, or when we are trying to understand situational vulnerability, how the nature of these vulnerabilities differ and changes in an Indian sphere. Because since 3-4 months, we have seen, we can observe the intersectionality which a human body, which a human being, which a self goes through, and what is the pedestal of that body. And that pedestal usually gets defined because we try to understand that human being along the intersectionality of gender, caste, religion, sexual identity, ethnicity for that matter. Now, there's this philosopher called Gilson. Gilson says that vulnerability is not merely a condition that we are obliged to ameliorate, but when understood in the more fundamental sense, it's also the ground for our responsiveness to one another. It is because we are vulnerable that we need ethics and social justice, but it is also because we are vulnerable because we can be affected and made to feel sorrow, concern, or empathy, that we feel any compulsion to respond ethically or to seek justice. Now, there's this philosopher called Marina Berzins McCoy. In her work called Wounded Heroes, she says that she's also basically aiming to look for an answer via vulnerability, that how its awareness and acceptance can add to the realization to human beings as well as to communities. So she says that vulnerability, it strengthens interpersonal bonds within a community and is closely intertwined with a number of different facets of ethical life. I thus suggest that rather than treating vulnerability as something which should be avoided, vulnerability is a necessary component of living a rich and authentic human life in a community. One of the submissions which I wanted to make in this lecture is this, that vulnerability, of whatever type of vulnerability we are talking about, it becomes that ground which intensifies and brings human together. It remains as an ontological ground for equality during COVID-19 times. In the crisis of COVID-19, vulnerability acts as the ground of sameness, equality. And during these times, vulnerability is also bringing strangers together in a very strange manner. Whether it's situational vulnerability, whether it's extended vulnerability, whether it's mutual vulnerability, we all are vulnerable in one way or the other. So instead of trying to bring or trying to make the other as a stranger. It's important that we embrace this vulnerability and we stand in solidarity with each other. So this sense of people sharing some kind of vulnerability, I argue that it can act as an epistemological ground of creating solidarity between different human beings. One of the larger submissions which I wanted to make in today's lecture is also to quote Trotsky, who said that in this text called The Problems of Everyday Life. He says that life returns many times to this the everyday reality, which creates individual and it diminishes them too. So it's very important that in these challenging times, I philosophically feel that you can understand a lot about a society by observing, by looking at, by trying to understand how that society is dealing with that crisis. And these are just not testing times, but these are also in that way a ground which are asking us this fundamental question which Aristotle has asked us so many years back, that how do you lead your life? What should be the way to lead an authentic life? And in that way, I think that this COVID-19 crisis, the way it has been unfolding in India, it's a mirror. And the mirror doesn't look very good because there are a lot of stains on this mirror. Until now, we haven't seen much examples of people standing in solidarity with each other, which should how technically the case should be. Even until now, there are different standards of de-evaluating someone's body, of certain kind of violence which is happening in the society, because the body or because the person is from a different class, different caste, different religion, different gender, or irrespective of whatever it is. So I would like to actually submit by saying that something which I also argued in my article, which me and Delorina have written together, that we should not make strangers in these moments, in these challenging moments. We should try to understand that these are the times where epistemologically, socially, politically, COVID-19 becomes that ground which brings us together. The strangers are no more strangers because of COVID-19. So thank you so much. And just a qualification, I think initially I did miss on to Professor Anirban Ganguly's name, who is the director of the center. So thank you so much, Professor Anirban Ganguly. I'm sorry I missed on to your name. So this is pretty much what I wanted to say. Thank you so much. And I look forward to questions, comments, and criticisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Richa. And believe you me, this is something really very insightful, something we do not think of in our lives in a general manner. Vulnerability, thinking about what a stranger is, not knowing when people go into isolation, even when they're surrounded with people. There have been so many learnings and there have been so many incidents that this pandemic has brought into our lives. So first of all, a heartfelt thanks for bringing in this particular topic for today's discussion. I request the participants, in case if they have any questions, they can just let us know and we can unmute them and they can ask the questions directly. Meanwhile, I definitely have a question over here. So when we talk about stranger, Richa, how would you take this particular fact into consideration that even when people are surrounded with families, there are certain things which are highly distressful. They cannot associate themselves to any agency at the point of time. And something that you used for migrant workers, with whatever had happened with them. Would you also say that even when somebody is within their families, amongst a lot of social pressures? Could it be from, what is your take on this? Can somebody be, even being surrounded with people, can feel isolated? Can he coin or she coin themselves as strangers?
Thank you so much, Meenakshi, for your question. Yes, actually, I think philosophically, I mean, it's my personal position. I also feel that there's a reason, right, that even those people who are staying with their family, the anxiety is, the way it's rising so highly. And it basically says, it tells us that a part of us would always be a stranger to our family members as well as to ourselves. And that's why I said that vulnerability acts as that mirror which mocks us and tells us that, oh, you thought you didn't have that aspect, but you just did it. So I think in that way, that's what I said, that, the way vulnerability and COVID are interrelated to each other, these are the most interesting times, because they are not only telling us a lot about the hidden features, the hidden strange features that we have in our own self, which I don't think we would have been able to discover it. But they are unfolding it in a different manner, in something like, there's so many testimonies, right, where people are saying that I ended up becoming violent, and their confession is, I never thought I could do that, but they did it. So
Right.
this is the stranger, right, which we all have that stranger in us. And this particularly these crisis times are in that way putting a mirror, and this crisis time is also mocking us by saying, see, you did it, you had
That's true. And there's a lot to learn from these migrant workers also, even after being disassociated with an agency by many people, by many parties, be it political, be it corporate or otherwise. There was one thing in common, which you also commented on. They were unified. They were very much unified, and this is something very unique in these stressful times. People don't want to work together. They were working in groups, and
yeah,
they ensured that none of them got affected because of them.
yeah, that's true,
That's something really very unique.
that's
I think Sakshi Priya is an audience member with us, and she is a noted. Sakshi, do you have any question for Professor Shukla here? Sakshi, can you hear us? Okay, I think there's some connectivity error here. Another question that I have over here is with respect to the kind of support system that should be in place. Uh, there are so many apps, as we hear of. There's something called as Your Dost, which is being extended by JGU, and this is for students, this is for faculty. However, there's something quite interesting to note in here, and I would like to know your opinion, Professor Shukla, in this case. A number of times we see examinations are heading up. There are media houses publishing a lot as to how you should be taking care of your children or how should they be taking care of themselves. Uh, Even during these pandemic times, there was a lot which was said initially. But now when we open up and now when we are heading towards peak, now when the cases of domestic violence have grown, stress, depressions have grown, we don't see anything in there. What is your psychological thought in this case? Is it assumed that it's all done and we're over with it and we do not know any such support?
Meenakshi, I think that with the way the cases are getting multiplied, I have no doubt about it that, I think most of the time when I started reading philosophy, I used to mock philosophers because they used to talk about uncertainty. And I used to, because I was so wishfully ignorant, I used to say that, what are they talking about? Life is about black and white, and
Right.
just, oh, what uncertainty. But I think these times also, because when you grow old, experience
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. We have Miss Charu with us in the audience, and she has a question for you. She says, how can philosophy help an individual living alone in a big city during these times?
okay. So I think my response to Charu would be that I personally feel, I mean, when I say this, my non-philosopher friends don't understand and they don't like it and they detest it, but I'll still say that I feel that philosophy is a therapy. If you do it correctly, Charu, it's going to help you. If you don't like reading books, you can actually start with, just listening to podcasts where, trust me, all these big books, all these big things which these philosophers have been talking about, have been saying, it does make sense. And trust me, of all, you can do everything and anything, but if you aren't clear about which kind of life you are leading and which kind of human being you're becoming, nothing would make sense after a point of time.
Thank you so much. That was indeed a lovely answer to that question. Last question from my side before we proceed towards the conclusion of the lecture is, recently Rishi Kapoor, the famous veteran actor, passed away. When he passed away, obviously there were not many people who could extend their support in true terms. The daughter reached mother almost after 3 days, if I'm not mistaken. And a week before, we saw that she gifted a pup to the mother. Can we say that external associations help people overcoming these depressing times? It may not be a complete 100% solution to what they're going through. It'll surely take some time. How far do you think that such objects, which are external in nature, do help people to overcome such situations?
I think what you are talking about in reference to externalism, in philosophy, we call it as symbolism. That, when someone who was very close to your heart, it could be your family member, someone whom you were closely associated with, what do you do of that love which you have in your heart?
Exactly. And you're vulnerable. You're absolutely vulnerable because you just didn't have any shoulder to share your stress with or share your pain with.
You're absolutely vulnerable. So what do you do with that much of love in your heart? And I think this kind of gesture of people writing a book, in the memory of someone who is no more with them,
Exactly.
adopting something and giving it to their loved ones, in these acts, in that way, they act as catharsis. They are symbolic in nature, and you're trying to transfer that love which you had in your heart in some way, so that what do you do of so much of love which you have in your heart when that person is no more in flesh and blood? We can't love in a transcendental manner, right? There's an importance that why do we love and why bodies matter so much when that person is not physically present around us. So I think these kinds of gestures that you're talking about, these are not only symbolic in nature, but it also talks about how philosophically love transfers.
Exactly.
And yeah.
We have Ms. Dalorina Nath with us in audience, and she has a question. Ms. Nath, I am unmuting you. You may please ask your question straight away.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Okay. Firstly, Professor Richa, it was a very, very good insight into vulnerability. Okay, so my question is, you quoted Robert Gooden, who said, who gave the consequentialist theory of vulnerability, right? So according to that, we have a moral obligation. The ones who are in a better off position maybe have a moral obligation to the ones who aren't. Now at these times of when everyone at the same time is dealing with COVID and their own little vulnerabilities, how do you judge who is at the top of that ladder and who is not? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question, Delorina. I think nobody is judging anyone on who is at the highest pedestal or who is at the lowest pedestal. What this philosopher is saying, which I found was interesting, was to introduce morality in our life in some way or the other. And he is telling you that when you know that you are privileged, when you know that you, even in this so much of challenging time, you can have food, you have electricity, you have roof over your head, you have the concept of leisure, mobility, even now, you can still loiter, then for sure, if you see the least or the most vulnerable in the society, it becomes a moral responsibility on you to protect them. and not protecting. I've seen people doing charity and putting it on social networking sites, hence performing charity. That, oh, I did something good, or hey, I'm going live about something good I'm doing, I'm feeling good about it. No, that's not how it works. That defines, that defends, that doesn't defend, that contradicts the idea of charity. That contradicts the idea of goodness. That contradicts the idea of protecting someone. When you protect someone, you don't perform that protection. You do it, full stop, done. So I think when he made that point, that philosopher was interested in talking about moral responsibility. In a very subtle way, he was training the imagination of the people, that how do I tell these masses that it's important that a society can only live together in a fulfilled manner when everybody and everything is being taken care of. And that only happens when we understand that our freedom comes with a sense of responsibility. There's responsibility which we have towards all the people around us. We cannot live on an island like
We have another question from Mr. Anish Mishra, who again happens to be from the audience side. He says, epistemologically, we seem to be excluding vulnerable sections in various works. That is, if I have understood epistemology correctly. But if we ever do broaden our epistemic inquiry, maybe make it more inclusive, then it is a step towards influencing policy decisions that affect them positively, as well as making a positive empirical impact on the lives of the vulnerable. What is your take on that?
Anish, could you please unmute yourself and...
I would
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Tell me.
Yeah, so the question, actually the question is, but if we ever do broaden our epistemic inquiry, maybe make it more inclusive, then is it a first step towards influencing policy decisions? Can broadening this epistemic inquiry make a positive difference to the lives of the vulnerable, or is it still always going to be theoretical? So how do you see a transition happening?
Okay, I see your point. So Anish, I feel that there was also a reason that intentionally I was using the term epistemologically, that unless and until, yes, epistemologically, why epistemology becomes important? Because it's source of knowledge, right? We know something. So imagine when we are understanding that vulnerability becomes a source of understanding the world. Vulnerability becomes a source of confession. Vulnerability becomes a source of realization. So, of course, by default, that realization, that confession, that mirror would play a very important role and should play an important role in policy making as well. There was a reason, right, that so many social scientists have been saying that a country should invest more on more of their GDP part in health sector, in education sector. So what are they doing? They are epistemologically trying to widen the horizon of the policymakers, of the people who are part of it. So does this answer your question?
Yeah.
We have another question from Ms. Anshu Chaudhary here. I would just unmute Anshu and maybe the participant can ask the question directly to you. Anshu, you may please ask your question. I think there's some network issue in here. I'll read out the question for them. Anshu says, hey, Professor Shukla, how do we find ourselves connected with our vulnerabilities when we share it in virtual platforms or helplines that give us respite in our everyday anxieties? Since touch or physical presence is a scarce commodity, how do we substantiate that through virtual platforms? How does that function?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. I think many philosophers have been framing this question, which Anshu has just asked me, that 3.5 months of no sense and idea of human civilization, no sense and idea of human touch, no sense and idea of how do we practice anything, how do we understand human beings around us. I think, Anshu, my response to you would be that at the end of the day, yes, we can't practice, we can't have human touch, we can't have an idea of how human civilization is progressing around us. But I would also say that in these difficult times, the only respite are words. In these difficult times, the only respite perhaps are testimonies, which we share, which we talk, which we distribute among ourselves. So when somebody is sharing their anxiety on an app or via a helpline, it's basically the word. Of course, the person is not with you in flesh and blood because, of these difficult times, but it is the word and it is the effect of the words. And that's why words matter so much. They are like, the way Japa Sartre said, they are like loaded pistols, So I think, of course, until the time these things and this uncertainty, the clouds of uncertainty aren't vanishing anytime soon, touch won't be possible, but words are eternal. So I would say that yes, we have to make do with words until then.
Richa, we have one last question over here with us, followed by a comment. This is from Anki Mishra. She says, ma'am, how are people from the medical fraternity susceptible to situational vulnerability in COVID-19 times?
Okay. So people who are the frontline warriors or the doctors, uh, situational vulnerability could act in a manner that I have like one, two testimonies which I was reading of doctors where they confess that they have a family, they have an immediate family to take care of, but they have been putting up in a hotel because they are working in COVID wards. So this would be situational vulnerability, Divyanti, that there's a situation where they have an obligation, a moral obligation to act as a frontline warrior, to do their duty as a doctor. And because of that, they are vulnerable because they can't see their family. They are vulnerable because they can't go back to their family. They have anxiety because the idea of shareness, the idea of why when we share vulnerability, it becomes little eases out. That doesn't happen. It cannot happen in person because so many of them are staying in a hotel. People are staying in PG because they didn't want to, at the end of the day, end up infecting their own family members. So this would be situational vulnerability.
So, yeah, we'll close off the Q&A round now. And before moving forward, we have a comment from Adarsh Priyadarshi. He says, indeed, the sense of vulnerability has opened a possibility of solidarity. But at the same time, state is attempting to break these possibilities, like the state's attempt of heroizing the vulnerability of essential workers. As you said, we need to act up. So how do you see the actions which can stop these state attempts? Because if you don't do that, then it will only be fictive solidarity. Would you like to comment on this as well, Richa?
Adarsh, I think solidarity is something, I don't think it can be created like a 2-minute Maggi movie, even though I understand your question. And even I've been thinking about it, but I feel that at the end of the day, unless and until you won't train the imagination of people, that firstly, they understand that we are human beings. It's basic to have empathy, sympathy, and this idea of strangeness. And we all are vulnerable in this situation right now. Unless and until we don't train our imagination and we don't try to, unless and until we don't cultivate our morality, where we are at least thinking that yes, the reflection is continuously happening about this is right, this is wrong, or did I just do discrimination in a subtle manner? Yes, I did. Why did I do that? So I think unless and until, first thing would be yes, it's very important to lead a life in which reflection, critical reflection is at the core. Your actions are getting reflected and you are reflecting on your action to begin with, asking yourself some deep fundamental question. And I think unless and until that individually is not going to happen, I don't think we have any right to question any status operandi at this point of time. Of course, I mean, we all have to be critical of the way things are happening and how they are unfolding. That is something which is not very pleasant to look at. And it's also something which should make us think about the policymakers and the morality of the policymakers as well. But as I said, that unless and until we don't train the imagination epistemologically, that it's not all right to discriminate. It's not all right to make strangers, and to accept that we are needy, we are vulnerable, and instead of shying it away or shying away from it, accepting it, understanding it, and embracing it. So unless and until we don't act on that, I think what you are saying comes from the second step. But firstly, everybody, it's important to accept this first.
Miss Professor Richa, we definitely have another question, but what we'll do, Kritika, is we will connect you to the professor with your question over email. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for taking out your valuable time and delivering such an insightful session. Believe you me, most of us as know about how vulnerability is really silly. And you know, uh, the kind of opinions that you've shared really make a lot of difference when we are staying in a society. Moving together, but when it comes to applying these codes in your real life is the actual litmus test, which many of us fail in day-to-day's life. So thank you so much for bringing this insightful topic, takeaways from these pandemic series. CAPBREI has already hosted 11 year series since March 2020. And this is certainly a benchmark which we wish to cross whenever we are bringing any such series. Our wholehearted thanks to all the speakers over here and the participants. Really successful. Thank you so much all. With that note, we would sign out now. Thank you so much, Professor Shukla, for joining us and delivering such an insightful talk.
Thank you, Meenakshi.
Good night. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and let's get along with something new next time.